Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a storyteller and the author of the Legacy of the Four fantasy trilogy, of which at episode release time, 2 of the 3 novels have currently been published. Her name is J.F. Monroe, and my interview with J.F. will follow the note-taking sounds. J.F. Monroe, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
You regard yourself as not just an author, but a storyteller. What makes an author a storyteller?
That's a great question. So how I like to look at it is that anybody can write a book, especially nowadays. They can write their work and put it out there, whether they use Amazon, whether they use traditional publishing. But a storyteller resonates after you read the book. That's what concludes a storyteller. So though I will write a fantasy romance that mixes mythology and adventure and battles and gods and angels and demons, and people gravitate towards that, what makes a storyteller is almost like the story underneath the story about those messy, deeply human emotions that make it stick with you after you close the book and finish it.
Feel free to tell our listeners more about yourself.
Absolutely. So my name is J.F. Monroe. I am the author of the Legendary Guardians Reunions. It's the first book in a fantasy romance trilogy. I try to balance that trilogy with, like I said, having like gods and angels and demons, but also these really messy, deeply human emotions. And at its core, the book is really about like identity, choice, love, and resilience. When I'm not being J.F. Monroe, I'm just me. I was born and raised in New York. I like hanging out with my husband and my 6-year-old son and our one-eyed dog. I spend way too much time playing video games and binge watching movies, reading, and fueling all of that energy with copious, unreasonable amounts of coffee.
The title of the series of your fantasy novel trilogy is Legacy of the Four. Without spoiling too much about your trilogy, what is each novel in the trilogy called, and what is the trilogy as a whole, as well as each novel in it, about?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So the first book is the Legendary Guardians Reunions. It is basically humans, angels, and demons exist under a peace treaty that is held together by the Four Horsemen, who are these legendary guardians tasked with protecting humanity from destruction. And one of my main characters is an archivist named Shade, who is basically forced back into a world that she tried to leave behind when her childhood best friend Theo returns after 10 years. And he returns as this vessel for the Horseman Death. So he is carrying a ridiculous amount of power, and he takes her with him on this journey to not only reunite the other 3 horsemen, but to stop this, overall looming threat to their world. So that's basically what the first book is about. The second book is not out yet. It comes out July 15th. It is called Descent into the Voidheart, which sounds really cool, but I will be honest, it's going to make a lot more sense once you read the first book. But the Voidheart is basically the territory of the demons. And so what happens is the first book is basically a foundation, establishing the 4 horsemen, reuniting everybody, figuring out who they can trust, who is the enemy. The second book is heading into the land of demons. And the third book is heading into the land of angels. But I won't go too much into the third book because that is not even have a definitive title just yet.
The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and the Hunger Games all inspired your trilogy in some way. How did each of those inspire your trilogy?
That's a great question as well. So for Lord of the Rings, it was the journey. I wanted my, I guess you could say, fellowship to have a very similar journey. And I really, really am very attracted to the reluctant heroes and the really, really seriously evil villains. I didn't want, I do follow a spectrum of like villains within my story. So you have like, those anti-heroes, and then you have those really dark Sauron type no redemption needed villains that I really, really like. And so I tried to pull themes from Lord of the Rings that I wanted in this trilogy without, of course, copying it. It's Lord of the Rings. I'm not going to touch that, but I wanted there's certain themes to be in that with the found family, the journey, and then the ridiculously evil villain. With the Hunger Games, I pulled the trials from that. I really loved that there was well, not loved because that sounds terrible, but like I did love in the writing how Suzanne Collins had kids selected every year to do the reaping, and I was like, that is just fascinating to me and speaks so well to like my brain. And so what I did in the first book was I had not just the kids, I had everybody go through these trials to be vessels for these four horsemen. So four would be selected after they go through these trials. I just really loved um, that that strategy that she evoked. So I thought that was really great. And then with Harry Potter, I it's just I guess that's a personal one because Harry Potter's so magical to me. And I really wanted this book to hold that magic to it. So yeah, it was a really rough journey with Lord of the Rings, and it had really brutal trials like the Hunger Games. And then for Harry Potter, who had its dark moments, but at the core of it was really about like hope. I really, really wanted to evoke that within this trilogy. And so it was really just me pulling themes that I loved and that I thought people would love from these beautiful, wonderful like classics to really enhance my trilogy.
What motivated you to write a fantasy trilogy?
Yeah, so when I started this, it was about 6 years ago, and I was convinced I had played some video games that had mentioned the Four Horsemen, and I had watched some TV shows, and I didn't really know a whole lot about them. So I started to do some research, and funnily enough, they're obviously stem from the Book of Revelation, and I was excited because I'm like, I am going to now learn everything about them, and really in that book, they only have a very small part describing them and their entrance to basically ride on humanity. And so I found that fascinating because I was like, look at how much I can do with them with these couple of lines in this book and one line in particular, and I won't spoil it because it is actually quite a big spoiler for the first book, but one line in particular stuck out to me, and from that line stemmed this journey that I would go on to write this trilogy. But before it became a trilogy, I was convinced that it was going to be this epic screenplay. The Four Horsemen mythology, brutal trials, clashes between angels and demons. But my characters had other plans. So in a screenplay, you want to try to fit it into a 90-page script. And that just wasn't good. I realized very quickly, that wasn't going to happen. So I had a full-fledged novel, and then it was the first of a three-part series. And that's just it just carried me from there. But in the beginning, when the idea first stemmed, it was going to be this crazy, wild, cinematic screenplay that turned into a trilogy.
An interesting aspect of your trilogy is that it emphasizes the emotional experiences of its characters. How do you ensure that readers connect with their struggles and triumphs, especially in a fantasy setting?
That's awesome. Okay, so though I'm writing, and this was very important to me, though I've read a ton of fantasy books, and some do it so well, and I wanted to make sure that I fell in line with those that made it very clear. Though I'm writing about fantastical worlds where humans and demons rule lands alongside humans, my focus of the book that I hope I portray very well is always on making my characters profoundly human. So even when they wield like undiluted power, they are vulnerable in their feelings, in their choices, and in conflicts. So at its core, when you strip away the fantasy element of my books, my trilogy is really solidly about like choice and growth and love and identity and about being completely unapologetically human. The struggles of like sacrifice and redemption and the tension between selflessness and selfishness make their journeys so relatable and impactful. I want a reader to sit down and read this book and say, I could do this. Like I'd make that choice. and I get why they made that choice. And specific moments that encapsulate this is, especially in the first book, is Theo's relationship with Shade. He re-enters her life and is drawn to her immediately. He seeks her out, only then to wrestle with like this deep regret for pulling her into this dangerous journey that could possibly get her killed. So his internal push and pull is constant. One moment he's trying to distance himself to protect her, and the next he's realizing how much he needs her. So that war within himself between his desires and what he believes is right, I believe, is so achingly human. We all go through moments like that. And so that's just one, but there are moments like that sprinkled throughout the story that really ground the magic and fantasy in this raw emotional reality, making both the struggles and triumphs feel deeply personal and hopefully rewarding for the readers.
You have a cinematic vision for your storytelling. How does this influence your approach for writing both the novels and any potential adaptations of your novels for visual media such as motion pictures or television?
So I have to see the scene play out in my head, almost like I'm watching a movie before I can physically, write it down or type it. And when I do, I try to aim to like translate that mental movie onto the page as vividly as I see it. And I want to be very clear. There are definite pros and cons to this approach. So when it works, like in a few key scenes in my book, it works really well and I love it. I'll reread those moments and still feel like I'm watching the scene unfold exactly as I envision it. Maybe I'll put on some music and it'll really enhance that. But just to be clear, there are also challenges to that. So sometimes my writing doesn't quite match the epic scene in my head, and it can take forever or multiple rewrites to get even close to what I want readers to see. And like I mentioned before, music often helps me bridge that gap. So for a few scenes, I did have music playing while I wrote it, and it was like magic. I could see the scene come alive. I could feel its energy as I typed, and it's really glorious and rewarding. Sometimes, it can be a hit or miss. I still go back to the first book and read through it, and I'm like, I probably could have done that a little bit better. But I will say that the cinematic approach is like not only shapes how I craft my narratives, but it's also how I imagine them transitioning onto the screen. I want readers to see and feel my story as vividly as I do. So whether they're reading the book or one day watching an adaptation, that visual and emotional connection is what drives me to keep refining my work until it's as close to that mental movie as possible.
In crafting your fictional worlds, how do you balance fantastical elements with experiences that readers can relate to?
I try to ground my characters by sending them on these deeply human journeys. So even as like in this fantastical world, even as wild and crazy things are happening all around them, the key for me is keeping the characters' reactions and emotions to the chaos completely relatable and human. So basically, no matter how fantastical the stakes get, the core of the story is always about the characters and what they're going through on a personal level, whether that's grief, love, fear, hope. Um, my win is if the readers can see themselves in the characters' responses to these extraordinary, fantastical situations. And that makes the stakes feel just that more real. It's not just about like saving the world or defeating the villain, right? It's about these experiences that impact the characters emotionally and how they grow through them. So it's that human element that I try really hard to narrate that cuts through the fantastical setting or whatever the fantastical plot may be.
Once your entire trilogy is published, will the entire trilogy have been independently, traditionally, or hybrid published, or will you have used different publishing types for the books of your trilogy?
I think I'm going to stick with independently published. I've been having some really great luck with it. I get to keep the creativity of it. Not that I would ever turn down trad publishing or hybrid opportunities, but right now I'm in a really good place. The only thing I will say, and I've actually gotten some help in this area, is that when they talk about writing a book, I had the most fun. I enjoyed myself entirely through the majority of that process because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write a book and that was it. And so I did so. They don't talk to you about that little marketing piece that you have to then do when you independently publish. You are responsible for also now figuring out a way to showcase and share your book with others. And that is the part where the immense struggle for me comes in. There's a lot of really talented people out there in marketing that do wonderful things. I am not one of those people. So that is one thing that's kind of been, a learning experience for me. But other than that, independent publishing has really, for me, been quite successful. I've enjoyed the journey so far.
How do you navigate self-doubt in your writing process, and what strategies have you developed for yourself to overcome it?
Yeah, so having a solid support system has been essential for navigating creative doubt and self-doubt. My family has been incredibly supportive, and I've said this to people before. My niece in particular has been absolutely amazing. She read I'm very, very protective of my work. I like how I write, even if it's fantastical lands, is a very vulnerable thing that I don't think enough people talk about. And so I let her read the trilogy before it went through, edits and its makeover, giving me the first round of feedback. And I told her, I said, listen to me, we have that really great relationship where she can just tell me how it is. Like, don't make me look foolish. You're going to read it and you're going to tell me if it's good because, her opinion mattered to me the most. And she sat through all three books and she was like, you got to get this out there, do it. And so that encouragement made a huge difference for me when navigating self doubt, to have that validation of someone that I know will not let me like get out there and make a fool of myself, a different perspective, if you will. But I also do want to give myself a little bit of credit here. Through this entire process, I did learn to be very gentle with myself. I'm usually my own harshest critic. There's really nothing anybody can say that I have not, already thought of when writing this trilogy. But I have allowed myself to be proud of what I've accomplished. Writing a book has been a lifelong dream of mine. Um, and I didn't just write one, I wrote three. So that's something I try to keep reminding myself whenever that doubt creeps in. And then one strategy that helped me um, framing the first draft it was something new to me. I just kept telling myself over and over, the first draft is for you. Nobody's seeing it. It is literally you telling yourself the story, which is a very loose quote that I just used there, I think by Terry Pratchett. Like the first draft is for you. It is you telling yourself the story. And it helped quiet those intrusive thoughts, right? I wrote this trilogy because I wanted to. And that's what mattered most. Now my focus is on sharing it with others, but at its core, this was a dream I fulfilled for myself, and that keeps me very grounded when that self-doubt arises.
One final question. You mentioned in your introduction that you like to play video games when you're not writing. What are some video games that you enjoy playing?
Oh my God, I could talk about this forever. That's a very dangerous question. Okay, so right now, we are in the middle of playing. And when I say we, me and my husband sometimes like take turns on it. But we're in the middle of playing Claire Obscure. And it's a good game so far. But we love like Dead Space, BioShock, The Witcher, Darksiders, Ghost of Tsushima, God of War. So and just in those that I stated, the lore in them definitely helped me create the lore within this book, The Legendary Guardians Reunions, and the other two books as well. I think that storytelling is what really makes me gravitate towards a video game, just like a movie, just like anything in life, really. And those games, the few that I just named now, their storytelling, I believe, in my opinion, is just top notch.
JF, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed myself immensely. Thank you so much.
It was amazing to interview JF about the legacy of the Four trilogy, and I wish her well with the final book of the trilogy. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.